All right, how you guys doing today? We about to hop into a reaction video. First things first, make sure you like that video, hit a little exit full screen, scroll a bit, like it, and then full screen it back up. You feel me? And I apologize in advance for these little uh white dots on the camera. I tried to wipe the lens. I don't really know what they are. At first there was one on my shirt, but that was like a literal piece of lint. These ones you can see I'm moving and they're staying stagnant. Maybe they won't show up in the recording. I don't know, but I apologize in advance. Also, if you see me looking back and forth, kind of like from you to over here, it's because I have my second monitor over here, and then the reaction screen is here. So when I angle myself here, it looks like when we're watching it that I'm watching it with you. But I also just glance over to make sure my microphone's still going, the recording's still going, just as a safety precaution, you know? And excuse my slightly cooked hair, I just washed it. So anyway, let's get into it. All right, so this is called the Crucifixion Dilemma that destroys Islam. It's by this channel called Testify. Like always, the original link will be down in the description. Let's get into it.
When it comes to the crucifixion of Jesus, the Quran and the Gospels offer dramatically different accounts. While the Quran claims that Jesus wasn't crucified, early Islamic scholars have proposed that somebody else took his place on the cross. But if this is true, then why did the disciples believe and preach that Jesus was crucified and resurrected? This discrepancy raises a serious question about the very foundation of Islam itself. When we read Surah 4, 157, it says, "But they neither killed nor crucified him. It was only made to appear so." Even those who argue for this crucifixion are in doubt. They have no knowledge whatsoever, only making assumptions. They certainly did not kill him. Muslims obviously take this at face value to mean that Jesus wasn't actually crucified. The traditional view is that somebody else was made to look like Jesus and took his place on the cross. This interpretation is backed by early Islamic sources like Ibn Abbas, a companion of the Prophet Muhammad. According to one account, it reads, "Just before God took Jesus up to heaven, Jesus went to his 12 disciples. His hair was dripping with water, as if he had just bathed, and he said, 'One of you will disbelieve in me 12 times after having believed.' Then he asked, 'Who among you will volunteer to be transformed to look like me and be killed in my place? Whoever volunteers will be with me in heaven.' A young disciple offered 3 times, and on the third, Jesus accepted. The resemblance of Jesus was cast over him, while Jesus ascended to heaven through a hole in the roof. When the authorities came, they found the young man and crucified him, thinking he was Jesus." Some Muslims will go ahead and argue that if this is true, then how could anyone really tell the difference between the real Jesus being crucified or someone who just looked like him? To most people watching, it would all be the same. Whether it was an actual Jesus, a lookalike, or even an illusion from Allah, it would have all been recorded the same way. Therefore, checkmate Christians, our perfect book is right, and your corrupt book is wrong. But here's the twist. If we go with the story from Ibn Abbas, the disciples knew that somebody else had taken Jesus' place on the cross. Yet, all of the available historical data shows that the disciples believed Jesus himself was crucified. This is puzzling because according to the Quran, the disciples were Muslims. If they believed Jesus was crucified, does that mean they were deceived by Allah or Jesus? How do we know the disciples believed that Jesus was crucified? The Gospels, which are based on their testimonies, indicate that Jesus died on the cross. For instance, Mark's Gospel, historically linked to the Apostle Peter, and John's Gospel, linked to the beloved disciple who was also present at the cross, both recount Jesus' crucifixion. The speeches in the book of Acts and the letters from the apostles, like Paul, also focus on Jesus' death and resurrection. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, Paul emphasizes the crucifixion and resurrection, a belief shared by the early Christian community. We talked about the problem that Paul poses for Muslims in the previous video. A further problem with the idea of substitution is why it was necessary for someone to take Jesus' place. Why not just have Jesus escape? Why put somebody, especially a loyal disciple, through such a painful and humiliating death if it wasn't even essential? It seems like this view is just a weak apologetic attempt to counter the very strong evidence that Jesus did in fact die by crucifixion, a fact acknowledged by the vast majority of biblical scholars and historians. And here is a tricky catch-22 for Muslims. If Jesus wasn't crucified, then either he was wrong about predicting his death, which would undermine his role as a prophet in Islam, or he actually was crucified, which would contradict the Quran's account. Think about it. If Jesus didn't die on the cross, it makes him a false prophet, meaning Islam is false since they regard Jesus as a prophet. But if he did die, it goes against the Quran, which also means that Islam is false. There is no easy way around this dilemma for Muslims. I think most Muslims would argue that Jesus didn't actually predict his own death as the Gospels claim, and these are just supposed Bible corruptions. But let's dive into some of the evidence that shows that he really did make these predictions. During Jesus' trial, false witnesses claimed that he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Later, they mocked him on the cross, saying, "Who would destroy this temple and rebuild it in 3 days? Save yourself." This sounds really weird because neither Mark nor Matthew give any context for why people would say this. However, if we turn over to John's Gospel, we get the backstory. In John 2:18-19, when Jesus was asked for a sign, he said, "Destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up." Here, Jesus was referring to his own body and his resurrection, not the literal temple. So John provides the pretext for the accusation that's hinted in Mark and Matthew's account. This kind of fit between different accounts, where one explains details that the others leave hanging, is known as an undesigned coincidence. It suggests that these accounts are independent and based on real events, lending credibility to the story. Another example is when Jesus predicted his death and resurrection in Mark 8:31-33, saying he would be killed and rise after 3 days. Peter, not understanding, rebuked Jesus, but Jesus firmly corrected him, saying, "Get behind me, Satan." This sharp rebuke would be embarrassing and therefore an unlikely detail for the early Christians to invent, especially given Peter's prominence, suggesting that this was based in real events. The numerous predictions and detailed accounts of Jesus' impending death and resurrection are just too compelling to be dismissed as mere inventions. Therefore, there's no escaping this dilemma. Either Jesus didn't die by crucifixion, which would invalidate his prophecy and make him a false prophet, making Islam false, or he did die by crucifixion, directly contradicting the Quran and making Islam false. Either way, Islam is false.
So the one thing that it seems that Islam can have in every single case is that your book is corrupted, right? But where would that corruption come from? Like, I guess that'll be our next kind of dive into where they think that kind of storyline goes, because you would, to prove it's corrupted, you would have to have certain parts that you're saying this is wrong, this is wrong. You can't just pull out of your butt every single time something doesn't fit and say that's a corrupted part, because then you're like, what does corrupted even mean? Does corrupted mean it was forged? Does corruption mean that the facts are false? Does corruption mean that the entire thing is false? Is it one verse that's corrupted, or is it the whole book? Meaning the whole book as in like Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John books, or is it the whole book as in the entire Bible? Because even then, I don't think the Quran goes back the same length as the Bible, right? Because they believe everything up until, Jesus's death and resurrection, I suppose. I'm pretty sure they believe the creation story. They believe he was born of a virgin and all that type of stuff. So they believe a lot of what it is. But when they pull out it's corrupted, where is the line drawn? You know what I'm saying? But it also says that Islam believes he's the promised Messiah. And if he's the promised Messiah means that he was going to save the earth. So if he's saving the earth, did the the Muslims, I'm sorry, did they believe that he did die for the sins of the world? And if so, right, did this fake guy die for the sins of the world? So Jesus himself isn't the promised Messiah, which I think is a crucial part that he left out of the video, right? Who's the promised Messiah in that case, right? Because they don't believe that Jesus was God. They just believe he's a prophet, but he ascended into heaven, right? But if he was a Messiah, what did he do? How can you be the prophet and a Messiah? Because a prophet's supposed to tell about what's going to happen in the future, possibly relating to the Messiah, but a prophet never was the Messiah. But Jesus also did speak in prophecies about himself, right? So prophet and Messiah, but that would entail that he was the Messiah because he prophesied about, yes, the Son of Man came to fulfill the law, blah, 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 and was the Messiah. So he prophesied, fulfilled the prophecies, and was the Messiah, versus if he didn't die for the sins of the world, he's just a prophet talking about the Messiah. So that means that guy would be the Messiah, or Jesus like duplicated himself, and it wasn't really just the cover of himself that he put on the other guy. He just duplicated himself and said, your identity, poof, it's gone. You're now a second half of me. I'll ascend. You die for the sins of the world. We're still one of the same, but it's on you, not me. Also, Islam began in 610 CE, following the first revelation to the Prophet Muhammad at age 40. These Gospels were all written around 90 AD. So I find it also hard to believe that the disciples were Muslims, but unless that's just about beliefs, I don't know what that would entail for their actions or beliefs. They also don't believe that Jesus rise from the dead. So I guess the fact that this other guy died for them, and did they believe that guy raised from the dead? And if so, then what does that say about him? Is he the Messiah, but he's not Jesus? So how does this work? It's a lot of interesting questions, and I hope that there's somebody in the comments that wants to give some answers out. I'm super excited to learn, and I look forward to more research. All right, that's going to be the end of the video. Hope you guys have yourselves a fantastic rest of your day. Peace.